Teachers/professors, how did you secretly get back at that kid? Story 1. Not me, but this happened to my friends. Our bonus project in physics was making an eggmobile, a vehicle designed to move an egg using only the power of an elastic band. The mark you got for this project would replace the lowest test score you got on the unit tests during the year. 2 of my friends worked together on one. One friend was an average student, while the other friend was fairly smart, but pushy and argumentative. A real Steve Jobs type. They constructed their eggmobile out of Lego, and it did work. However, the physics teacher was a little tired of friend number 2 at this point of the year. The mark he gave was enough to give student 1 a nice boost. However, it was 1 point lower than student 2's lowest test score. We had the same project in school, with the aim being to get the egg as far as possible, but our teacher failed to mention that the egg needed to survive the journey. After several kids making spectacular cars from Technics and Lego, etc., I rocked up with my trebuchet and smashed all previous records. Story 2. My favorite English teacher once led a discussion about Vietnam War novel The Things They Carried into a discussion about drugs and paranoia in order to F with the dude that always showed up to class high. She didn't look at him once, just kept saying stuff to mess with him, while, might I add, actually leading a very interesting conversation about drug abuse in Vietnam. I was sitting across the room from him, and he looked like he was dying. I was baked sitting in my high school history class, and we were working on some individual textbook work, and she came up behind me, made some weird noise in my ear, then looked me in the eye and asked how my day was going. I shat a brick. I won't say whether I know this from experience or not, but it's pretty common at that age to assume no one can tell when you're high. Turns out, they pretty much always can. Not every teacher will get back at you for it like the teachers in these stories, but it's still a bad move. Let's face it, teachers are like parents. They have favorites, even if they'll never admit it. Making them think you don't respect their class isn't the best way to top the list. Story 3. I had a letter mailed to my office, as in paid postage, etc., that was basically threatening me, saying I better stop handing out C's and D's, or word on the street was going to be that I was a bad teacher, and no one would take my class, and I'd be out of a job. I had a pretty good idea of who it was. Obviously, I immediately ruled out all the students doing well in my classes, but didn't think direct accusations would be really effective anyway. I decided to take it to each of my 3 classes and turn it into a lesson on faulty rhetoric. My expectations were exceeded when I began to read the letter out loud, and without fail, each class erupted in laughter and exclaimed things like, "What a butthole," before I could even weigh in. The kid I suspected the most definitely sat slumped in his chair without much to say that day. Story 4. My abnormal psych, a 400 level class, so you would assume people in the class were interested in the field, had us visit a local homeless shelter. This was an accelerated night class, so classes were 4 hours long. She arranged for us to go during our normal class time. A few people in the class felt it was dumb or a waste of time and just bailed just as the tour was starting. The final exam for that class was about 4 questions that were very easy to answer if you stayed for the whole tour, and absolutely impossible if you did not. I imagine this is pretty funny to the person who would have stayed on the tour, and to be fair, I'm one of those people. However, basing your entire final exam on 1 day of class is actually not the sign of what I'd call a good teacher. Even if this accelerated class had 2 midterms, which would be crazy for an accelerated class, there should still be several days' worth of material to cover on that final. Basing it all on the tour doesn't do a great job of testing what your students really learned. It also punishes anyone who might have legitimately been sick or absent that day. That's like grounding all of your kids because there was 1 cookie missing from the jar. Plus, for those who haven't been to college, I should note that a lot of classes have weighted finals that can account for up to 70% of your grade. So depending on how the class was weighted, those unfairly punished collateral kids might have failed not only the final, but even the entire class. Ooh, thanks, Prof. Story 5. Not a teacher, but a student who got back at that teacher. In my sophomore year, I transferred to a small Catholic high school because I was bullied pretty badly at my public high school. I was very eager to show my teachers I would work hard and to show my parents that I wanted to improve my grades. English has always been my strong suit, so I was excited when my English teacher assigned us 4 essay questions the first day for the Scarlet Letter. I started to work on them from the moment I got home to the moment I went to bed. I was very excited and knew my answers were very in-depth and dealt with the symbolism that Hawthorne is famous for. Let me note that I used absolutely no outside sources for my answers, only my mind and the book. When I got to class, I excitedly handed them to Mrs. Leary and couldn't wait till she graded them. Silly me. She handed them back with my answers crossed out and the word plagiarism written in huge red letters across the top. I was heartbroken. I didn't know what to do, so I said nothing. The next 3 assignments, the same thing happened. On the 4th, I came out of school crying. My aunt was picking me up that day because my mom had a meeting. My aunt was ticked off. She's a very cool lady and gets along with everyone. But when she gets mad, hell hath no fury. She marched into the school and reamed Leary out. Leary acted all apologetic, blah blah blah. So the next assignment, I was happy to get back. But guess what? Same thing happened. Big red X's. And at the top, read and define the word plagiarism. So it became clear I needed to take matters into my own hands. I asked what the problem with my paper was, and she said it was obviously beyond your reading comprehension level. So I said, listen lady, I don't know what your reading comprehension level is, but I'm not going to dumb my work down for you. I was sent to the principal, to whom I showed all 5 assignments. She got quite a kick out of it. I guess she was awful to everyone because she ended up getting fired. F you, Mrs. Leary. I've not only heard stories about teachers like this, but I've lived stories like this at least 3 times. I'll never understand it. Some teachers honestly seem to hate children in general. That's like getting a job for the Humane Society when you hate pit bulls. Except that's at least a low-paying job you might take out of desperation. Teaching is also a low-paying job, but it's one you need certifications for. Who goes through all that trouble just to work with people they hate by default? I honestly want an answer if anyone has one. And I don't just want the one-word answer, Karen. I want at least 600 words, 2 sources, double-spaced. You can turn in your assignments down in the comments. Story 6. High school teacher here. Had a little poop ball of a kid we'll call Anthony. Complained about everything. Did no work whatsoever. Talked poop about everyone. Made fun of kids with disabilities. You name it. And of course, he was always the first to start shrieking that he was the victim in every situation. Everyone was against him. How come he always got picked on, and so forth. Now in my teaching career, which has spanned the better part of a decade so far, I've taught more than 1,000 kids. Plenty of those have been bad kids. The thing about bad kids, though, is they're usually bad for fairly simple reasons. Stuff going on at home, unmedicated or undiagnosed mental illnesses, trauma in their past, hell, maybe just lonely. If you pay attention, you can find out why almost any kid is acting out. That said, out of 1,000+ kids, I've encountered maybe 10 who are genuinely broken people. You could call them sociopaths, no trace of empathy, no trace of conscience, or even inner life. People who basically exist to serve their own desires exclusively and have no compunctions about how they might most quickly realize those desires. Anthony was one of those kids. The worst thing about him was his constant tendency to immediately poop upon anything that anyone else had put effort into, including my lessons. We would nearly have these very vulnerable, tender moments in the classroom where kids were talking about big, important issues and really growing intellectually in awesome and uncomfortable ways. And then Anthony would call them freaking gay or whatever else. One day, this girl, Patrice, an incredibly sweet girl, sensitive with an artist's heart, is sharing something in class for the first time. Visibly nervous, shaky voice. Anthony, of course, begins making fun of her hair, her glasses, her face. Quiet enough that it's plausibly a whisper, but loud enough so that we can all hear what he's saying. I start walking toward his desk, but I'm interrupted when Patrice very, very calmly says, "F you, Anthony." The entire class was dead silent. This girl never spoke, let alone swore. And she said it with such self-control. Everyone's eyes are on me, waiting for me to react. Anthony starts screaming. Did you hear that? She said F. You always get me in trouble when I say F. This stuff ain't fair. How this ugly witch gonna... I say, huh? I didn't hear anything. Turn back around and continue the lesson. A few kids cheered. It felt really good. Story 7. A lot of the guys in my high school would dip chewing tobacco during school. Most of the teachers would just roll their eyes, tell them to spit it out, and confiscate the rest. A couple teachers were known for punishing teens who were dipping, and would go so far as to suspend them for it. One of those teachers enjoyed messing around with her students. If she realized you were dipping, she'd give you an out. You could either admit to dipping and get sent to the office for disciplinary action, or you could drink from the spit bottle that you were pretending was a Coke. I saw too many classmates try to avoid punishment by taking a big swig, only to rush off to the bathroom to vomit. Can't say they didn't know the risk before they walked in, though. Story 8. The way I got back at that kid is tricking him into believing he's just playing and getting away with things, while he actually learned without knowing that he was actually learning. Booyah! That kid is going to keep that knowledge with him for the rest of his life. Playing the long game here. He's going to be a CEO for a flourishing company and curse this teacher for giving him knowledge. To be honest, while I get that the commenters clearly enjoyed this, I feel like we need way more information to believe the teacher actually did anything here. It's very possible that the kid really was playing around and getting away with things, and was simply smart enough to learn at the same time. Not all class clowns are dumb. That's just a cliche. And while this is also a cliche, it is true that some kids act out in class because it's teaching at a pace slower than they're capable of learning, so they just get bored. However, some kids don't learn well when there's someone in class causing distractions. So letting him get away with it might have just hurt other students. I'm not sure you get to say booyah for allowing that to continue. Story 9. My friend was a professor for years. He told me this one last year. A group of lousy, talkative students started acing the weekly tests in the seminar periods. We're talking marginally passing to a sudden spike of consistent 100%. He figured out that they had a friend who was in an earlier seminar period in the week, feeding them the questions before they took it themselves. He emailed them, and instead of busing them, asked them to teach the whole class on their newfound study habits. He made them all stand in front of the class and teach how they study. The whole lesson was a load of shoot, and was plainly visible to everyone. Then, for the next test, he rotated the questions for their seminar time. The whole group got 0 out of 100 across the board. He emailed them again and plainly said, "Guess those study habits need some tweaking, huh?" Story 10. I taught English at a ritzy private school in South Korea. We weren't allowed to discipline the kids for any reason, no matter what, because the school was making money from the tuition. For the most part, the kids, grade 5 to 6, were pretty good. But there was this one kid. He was a little poop about everything, always disruptive, bullying the other kids, throwing pencils, writing swear words in Korean on the whiteboard before class, never listening, etc. I started eating a lot of kimchi on the days I taught that specific class, which gave me wicked indigestion. When I walked by the kid, I would let out those horrible, silent, creeping, hot farts. Not one ever blames the teacher, and after a couple weeks, he became known as the farty kid. He was still a little poop, but it made me feel better knowing that he was knocked down a few pegs. Is it possible that working with 5th graders might have rubbed off on this OP just a little bit? Because this definitely feels like the kind of revenge no one older than 12 would even think of. Don't get me wrong, I'm lactose intolerant, so when I'm mad at my roommates, I just eat a pint of ice cream and let my weaponized intestines go to town. But I'm also well aware that I'm probably about the last person you'd ever want teaching your kids. Story 11. My stats professor said he saw a group of really talkative and distracting kids doing well, and he thought it was fishy. He looked at the tests and saw that they were all the same answers. Then he looked at the seating chart and noticed that they could all look over each other's shoulders to the front of the class where the smart, quiet girl sat. Solution? Give her a different test. Only her. When he handed back the tests, he told everyone who got under a certain grade, like 50%, to come see him. Each student got like a 10% or something. When they were alone, he basically said, "Well, this is your punishment for cheating. Don't do it again." I thought that was awesome. Sorry, not to mention this was a high school/secondary school stats class. If it were college, definitely would have/should have been reported. Story 12. These two girls in my econ class were cheating all the time. They turned in this paper on the Federal Reserve that didn't get picked up with the plagiarism checker, but they both turned in the exact same paper as each other. I told them, "You guys did a great job on this paper. You get 50% and you get 50%. In retrospect, I shouldn't have done it in front of the class. I had a teacher who had this policy for every assignment. It sucks being on the other end, especially when you actually didn't cheat. You don't get a trial or an opportunity to defend yourself or anything. You don't even find out the names of who you allegedly cheated with. You just find out weeks later that you'd got a 33% on some homework assignment because you were allegedly cheating with a couple people." I get the point that the response is making, but I do have to wonder how exactly a teacher would come to the conclusion that 3 people had written the same paper if no one had actually cheated. That feels like a pretty monumental coincidence. Even on short answer questions, you'd expect maybe a few answers to be worded mostly the same, but every answer being the same between 2 or 3 students would be remarkable. I'm not saying the guy actually did cheat, but I wouldn't blame the teacher for thinking so under those circumstances. Honestly, if he was dividing 100 between 3 people, I just want to know how he chose who got the leftover point. Story 13. There was a kid in my class who always was cheating on my tests and quizzes. I caught him several times and contacted the parents, but nothing was ever really done about it, aside from the fact that he got zeros if I caught him. I don't think his mom ever really believed he was cheating as much as he was, and there were plenty of times I probably didn't catch him. One summer midterm, he missed the test. He came back the day I gave the class their scores back, which also had the answers, but not the questions. I saw him sneakily talking to his friends, and they gave him their papers that had the answers on them. I didn't say anything, but the makeup midterm had the same questions, with all the answer choices moved over by 1 letter. Little Mustard got a 3% on a multiple choice midterm. I assume he must have read 1 question and then copied the rest from his friends. Justice. This was kind of a common thing for multiple choice tests for me growing up. The teacher would print off 2 or 3 copies of the same test, just with the order of the questions mixed up. Story 14. Not secretly, but I learned to take copious notes and have a file on every student. Lazy students will often try to throw the blame on the teacher. I had 2 students request a meeting with the dean of students to discuss my unfair grading, and I showed up with a stack of evidence. Every substantive in-person interaction was documented on the front of the file, and I included copies of every email and note on the inside. There's nothing more embarrassing than coming face-to-face with your own laziness and being unable to wriggle free. They started paying attention after that. My boss always says that the team with the better documentation always wins. Bravo. Story 15. I was in a class where the professor had 2 blatant plagiarists stand up and read both of their papers at the same time. Halfway through, without even looking at them, and his eyes turned to a wall, he said out the last conclusion statement. Turns out they stole from his own body of work, and they just changed enough of the paper to make it past the checker. But he reads every paper anyways. It was the most awkward and hilarious thing I've watched to this day. He then told them that each paper they wrote would be read out loud by the master each submission, and he would personally grade their papers. They also had to sit at the front of the class, and he would call on them with every open-ended question first. To be clear, he was furious that these 2 stole from him, called it their ideas, changed it into a weaker structure, and complained about their lower grade. He crushed them. It was great. Story 16. I've taught physics at the college level, and my experience was that kids would inevitably fail. It turns out, someone who brazenly copies their homework doesn't learn enough to pass the exams, for example. So hey, no need to plan revenge. They would do it to themselves. Considering gas companies made record profits this year after hiking prices due to a shortage that never existed, and given they simply expected everyone not to realize that extra revenues wouldn't actually mean a profit increase if their costs had gone up as well, I don't actually agree with the premise that cheaters never prosper, and this does apply to school as well. I can see where it might not apply to a class like physics, but depending on the class setup and the exam format, some people can and will still find ways to cheat on a final. I don't agree with all forms of revenge in this thread, and I'm pretty sure most schools and universities have actual policies in place that probably don't include things like farting in your student's face, But the point is that simply waiting for it to run its course is an absolute poor substitute for dealing with it head on. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.